Welcome to the Toronto book launch of The Fall and Rise of American Finance, From J.P. Morgan to Blackrock, written by Scott Aquanno and Steve Maher and published by Verso. This evening's event has been organized by the Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education with support from the Center for Social Justice. My name is Lenart, and I'll be the moderator this evening. Before I introduce the topic, I just want to say a couple of words about the Leo Panitch School. The Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education was founded in 2023 by members of the Socialist Project. The school emerged at a moment when popular frustrations abound over inequality, the narrowing of democracy, the squandering of human potential, and the ever-clear reality of impending environmental catastrophe. We strive to provide radical, accessible, and practical educational programming for those seeking to better understand and address the crisis of our current times. Tonight's launch will feature Scott and Steve speaking to some of the themes raised by the book, followed by some general discussions and audience Q&A. Please stick around following the program for some refreshments and to continue the discussion. And before I say a bit about the topic, I just want to read a land acknowledgement. The Socialist Project and the Leo Panitch School would like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. The land on which Toronto sits remains home to many Indigenous people. While we must strive to do more than just acknowledge, we are grateful to have the chance to gather and learn from one another in this place. Further, we acknowledge the right of First Nations peoples to true national self-determination. We also believe that it's important to recognize the common struggles experienced by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous working people, as well as the ways in which capitalism relies on prejudice, exploitation, and oppression to keep us divided. And as we all know, there's a genocide currently going on in Palestine, and we encourage everyone who is here to engage with the Palestinian youth movement and to heed calls for action from Palestinian trade unions and civil society groups. Now I want to move over to say a couple of words, sentences about the importance of the financial industry and why it's important to understand how it works. As became starkly apparent with the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, financial institutions occupy a crucial position in the modern world economy. In the present day, financial systems of many developed and developing countries, where crucial investment decisions that shape the future trajectory of economic activity are controlled by private financial and business elites, democratically endorsed policies might be undermined through various legal forms of non-cooperation. Any proposed redistributive policy with disadvantageous prospects for the vested interests of powerful elites might be preempted through various forms of financial pressures. In turn, popular sovereignty will be undermined as governments, in order to maintain a good business climate, feel forced to sacrifice electoral promises which rely on increased social spending. Given that it is in part through the allocation of funds to some projects rather than others that a society sets itself on one developmental trajectory rather than another, excluding large swathes of the population from participating in financial decisions also means that one deprives them from having a say about the future development of society. Insofar as one shares a commitment to the vision of a just society, as one that provides for freedom in both the sense of creating the conditions for self-determination and absence of domination, a powerful class with the potential to dominate finance and investment, yet remain unaccountable to the effect of citizenry, will present an obvious obstacle to the achievement of political equality and thus justice. And with those words, I pass the microphone over to Scott and Stephen.
Thanks a lot, Leonard. And Thanks everyone for coming. We've got a couple of these events now. The book came out what, a month or two ago now, 2 months ago. And we've done a couple of these events, but I have to say that this one feels, I think, to both of us like the most important, because here is where we both were very profoundly shaped politically. We were both profoundly shaped intellectually. It's the community of activists and scholars here in Toronto, many of whom are here today, who really were so influential for us being able to even formulate such a project and to develop the ideas that are in this book. So many people here, played a role, large and or small, in the final product that many of you have purchased, and hopefully many more of you will purchase before you leave. And so yeah, this event does feel especially important to us. And I really want to thank you for coming out and listening to a talk about something as boring as the financial system. But I'm going to try to make the case, we're going to try to make the case that it's actually not boring at all. And that actually how we analyze the financial system, how we think about the role of finance in contemporary capitalism, is actually incredibly important for how we orient as socialists politically. And that it's not just a matter of boring details and technical information about the internal functioning of finance, but it actually has a profoundly important implication for how we think of our political task and how we assess the conjuncture that we're in. And so hopefully that will come out in the comments we're going to make. Okay, so the book traces what we call the fall and rise of American finance, from the collapse of the great finance capital empire of the robber baron J.P. Morgan, all the way through the rise of the big three asset management companies following the 2008 crisis, State Street, Blackrock, and Vanguard, to become the most powerful institutions in the contemporary financial system. And what we wanted to do with the book was to provide an accessible and non-technical narrative account of how the financial system works, how it developed over time in the American social formation, and how the development and reproduction of the financial system over time was interconnected with the formation and reproduction and evolution of state power as an important, the most central kind of element of the system of domination that we know of as capitalism. So we wanted to show how it works and how it evolved over time and how it's part of the broader system of power, class power that we call capitalism. And we wanted to especially challenge the idea that is so pervasive on the left. In fact, it's all but common sense. And you hear it from political figures ranging from Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn all the way to Hillary Clinton and even, of course, Donald Trump. That finance is somehow parasitic on industry. That finance drains, the rise of finance comes at the expense of industrial capital, that it has been, the period in which finance has become hegemonic has been one in which industrial capital has become weaker, and that the capitalist system is falling apart, and that we're in kind of late stage of capitalism. And as we try to show in the book, that is actually close to the opposite of the case. It's close to the opposite of true. And in fact, capitalism is strong. And that is incredibly important for us to reckon with as socialists as we think about how to take it on. And we do this, we tell this story by recounting the history of capitalist development from the fall of the J.P. Morgan finance capital empire all the way to the rise of Blackrock, State Street, and Vanguard after 2008. So Scott's going to run through some of the ways that we think about that history and give us a sense of that narrative, and then at the end I'm going to come back and try to summarize with some key points. So take it away, Scott.
Thanks, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, the book is really about the role of finance in the making of American capitalism. And it traces the rise of financial power from the late 1800s to present, and charts the different forms that financialization has taken over this period. We argue that the history of financialization has 4 distinct phases. First, a classical finance capital phase. Second, a managerial phase. Third, a neoliberal phase. And fourth, a current new finance capital phase. These phases form a cycle consisting of the decline and the gradual, uneven, and contradictory rebuilding of financial power. we show that these phases are marked not by sharp breaks, but rather by both continuity and change. Moreover, we show that each phase is punctuated by a major crisis managed by a relatively autonomous capitalist state acting in the general interests of capital. For us, the contradictions of capitalism can, of course, never be truly resolved, and the system must change continuously to overcome the barriers and crises it generates. So I'll start by looking at the classical finance capital period, noting some key trends and components of that period, and then move all the way up to the present period before handing the microphone back to Stephen, or Steve.
Despite what it says on the cover, I am Steve.
Okay, so first the classical finance capital period, which lasted roughly until 1929 and started roughly in the 1880s. So during this period, ownership and control of industry came to be centered around large investment banks, above all, of course, J.P. Morgan, the vaunted House of Morgan. These investment banks themselves sat at the center of the national banking system, which developed in the US in the 1860s. And we can talk more about that, of course, in the Q&A if needed. The power of these giant investment banks hinged on two things. First, their ability to issue credit and their control over vast pools of money capital. Second, it hinged on their position as the largest stockholders or shareholders within the corporations they controlled. This ownership of equity allowed these investment banks to sit on the boards of directors of these firms and effectively form interlocking directorates of the firms they controlled. The result of these two forms of financial power over industry was a fusion between finance and industrial capital, what Rudolf Hilferding termed finance capital. Within this system, financial institutions came to play a direct and active role in the management of industrial corporations. They shaped the strategic direction and organizational structure of the firms they controlled. But critically, this period of classical finance capital was not characterized by financial firms micromanaging the day-to-day operations of industrial firms. Finance capital for Hilferding and for us was not about that. Rather, these financial firms exercised more general control over a network of industrial firms. Finance capital and the development of the financial system during this period depended, we show, on the continuous expansion of the state's economic functions. For example, we showed the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 marked a deep transformation in the logic of the banking system and the money system in the US. The Fed integrated the banking system with state power in a new way, further blurring the relationship between private money credit generated by banks on the one hand and state money on the other, leading to a form of hybrid money, which again we can turn to in the Q&A if there's any interest in doing so. I would love to turn to that issue, of course, but few take me up on this point.
He actually threatened to do the whole talk on hybrid money.
At one point, it will be all hybrid money. The second phase was the managerial phase, which lasted from 1930 or so to 1979. This period, as I noted, emerged out of the Great Depression and through the regulations enacted by the state in response to the collapse of the banking system. These regulations, most notably the 1933 and 1935 Banking Acts, formally separated banks from the governance of industrial firms, leading to a separation of ownership and control. Those who owned the firm, shareholders, were now formally different from those who controlled the firm, managers. With the end of finance capital and the fusion that characterized the classical period, investment banks became intermediaries, supporting the issuance and sale of corporate securities to other buyers. And the financial system came to pivot for the first time, really, around commercial banks. These banks were ever more tightly connected to the state, and they came to play a pivotal role in the internationalization, of the dollar and the making of a new informal American empire. But this was a period in which insider corporate managers, not banks, were the preeminent force in the economy. This was a period of what we call industrial hegemony, and what others have called as well. The absence of large blocks of shareholders in this period allowed insider managers to control industrial firms without facing a coherent challenge from outside investors. Also important was the ability for industrial corporations to finance investment to retained earnings, as well as the significant state intervention in these firms through the military-industrial complex, which emerged following the Second World War. The hegemony of industrial corporations in this period was thus fully supported by what we call a New Deal state. This New Deal state was geared more towards legitimation than the previous state form and the neoliberal state form, and was above all a taxed state. Critically, and this gets to the form of financialization that evolved during this period, we showed the separation from banks from industrial corporations actually led industrial corporations to internalize a range of financial functions. The financialization of the non-financial corporation thus originated in the very heart of the post-war golden age. These firms developed extensive capacities to raise and to lend capital independently, precisely because of the separation of the suppression of finance through the New Deal Acts. Corporate financialization was, in many respects, therefore, a direct outcome of the success and the profitability of the post-war golden age of capitalism. So we trace the origins of today's financialized economy right back to the golden age of capitalism. This managerial system was also, of course, inherently crisis-prone, as union rights and New Deal programs posed barriers to accumulation. A profit crisis emerged in the 1970s. This was only resolved through the neoliberal authoritarian state and the financialization and globalization of the economy. So financialization and globalization were not problems for capital, but solutions to the 1970 profitability crisis. And so this takes me to the third of the four periods, the neoliberal period, that lasted from 1980 to 2008. During this period, the hegemony of industry was overtaken, we argue, by a new form of financial power. This resulted from the integration of global financial markets, which provided the essential infrastructure for corporations to circulate value across internationalized production networks. But it also hinged on the proliferation, paradoxically, of worker pension funds, which began to concentrate capital and equity in the 1960s and 1970s. These pension funds were, of course, managed by professional money managers. And this movement towards concentration was critical in therefore overcoming the fragmentation of equity that had defined and characterized the previous managerial period. So during the neoliberal period, financial institutions again came to wield significant power over industrial firms through a wave of concentration and centralization of corporate stock. Yet, unlike the classical period, financial firms didn't exercise direct control over the network of firms that they owned. They exercised rather broad structural discipline. This regime of financial hegemony was centered around banks, as well as a new group of institutional investors which held large concentrations of stock. These institutions were all linked together in a new system of market-based finance, which depended on a very complicated chain of intermediation. The market-based financial system integrated money markets and derivative markets and securities markets in a new way. And it was this system that was at the very center of the 2008 financial crisis. So critical for understanding how the state managed the crisis is understanding the market-based financial system that had developed in the 1980s and 1990s. We argue, finally, the neoliberal state supporting this configuration of corporate and class power was organized around debt, and further was deeply authoritarian in its nature. Insofar, to this latter point, insofar as power was concentrated within unaccountable state institutions, the OCC, the CFTC, the FDIC, the SEC, and of course, above all, the Federal Reserve, policy making increasingly occurred within unaccountable offices of the US state that were separated to a significant degree from congressional pressure. Indeed, we show that the neoliberal economic policy was characterized by the subordination of fiscal policy made by Congress to monetary policy made by the central bank, which had risen to the seat of state power during this period. I'll finish my comments with this brief discussion on the new finance capital period, which evolved out of the 2008 crisis. The global financial crisis in 2008 was, in many respects, as deep as the Great Depression, despite the very different outcomes. New finance capital, as the name indicates, marks a new form of fusion between finance and industrial capital. What we see during this period, coming out of the great financial crisis of 2008, is that diffuse financial power of the neoliberal period of shareholder capitalism was centralized to a much greater extent in giant asset management companies that have come now to exert control over industrial capital in a way reminiscent of the classical finance capital period. The big three, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, as Steve mentioned, collectively today are the largest or second largest shareholder in firms that comprise 90% of total market capitalization in the US economy. This includes 98% of firms on the S&P 500, which tracks the largest American companies. The big three own on average collectively more than 20% of the companies in the S&P 500. This is a degree of concentration of equity that is historically unprecedented. So by pooling the already massive pools of capital pooled by pension funds, these asset management companies further centralized financial power, again gaining a degree of power that is very reminiscent of the days of J.P. Morgan. We argue that this form of concentration and centralization emerged out of the crisis hinged on the development of a new form of state power, a form of state power which we refer to as a risk state. The risk state is aimed at using state power to absorb and deflect financial risk in a new way. The best way to demonstrate, or to talk briefly perhaps about the relationship between this new risk state and this new form of asset management is by looking briefly at quantitative easing. What quantitative easing did was generate asset price inflation that led to a de-risking of equity and buoyed the stock holdings of passive management firms. And again, we can kind of go over this a bit more fully in the Q&A, but quantitative easing led to an expansion of asset appreciation that ended up benefiting passive management firms, the firms that controlled index funds and other passively managed investment funds, and of course these firms were BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Before 2008, 3 out of 4 equity funds were actively managed by a fund manager in search of alpha, or the investment gain above the market trend. By 2020, this had completely changed. More than half of all investment funds were controlled by passively managed funds that simply passively track an index and are not actively traded. The great beneficiaries, of course, of all of this were the big 3 asset management firms. As passive management firms are unable contractually to sell the firms within their portfolio, they are forced to, or have an incentive to intervene in their portfolio firms to increase the value of the assets they control. As a result, therefore, of their very passivity, these firms became active in terms of managing the firms within their portfolio. In the final chapter of the book, we look at the contradictions and the uneven tendencies that emanate from this period of new finance capital. And again, we can kind of talk to those points in the Q&A. What I'll do now is I'll shift the microphone back to Steve, and he's going to pull out some of the central arguments that we developed through the book out of this historical account of the different forms of financialization and the slow, gradual evolution of this new form of finance capital.
Thanks, Scott. So we have the classical finance capital period dominated by the investment banks like the Robert Baer and JP Morgan. We have the managerial period dominated by, or during which we saw the hegemony of industrial capital. And we have the neoliberal period in which financial hegemony of a kind of diffuse and decentralized form reemerges. And finally, after 2008, we have the new finance capital period in which the big three asset management companies have displaced the banks as the most important and powerful institutions in the contemporary financial system. And so through this narrative, we basically try to distill 6 key arguments. The first is that financialization is not new. So we oftentimes hear the argument made that financialization is something that supposedly emerged in the 1980s, or which is characteristic of a supposedly late stage of capitalism, and therefore related to the decline and decay of the capitalist system. But as we show, this is far from the case. In fact, financialization was absolutely essential for the early health and dynamism of American capitalism, right? The concentration and centralization of credit and money capital in the hands of institutions like the JP Morgan banking empire was essential for the initial development of the corporation itself and for the integration of the national economy, which became much more competitive as a result. You could circulate investment much more easily and cheaply. And then after the demise of the investment banks, we saw a kind of new form of financialization emerge right in the heart of the post-war Keynesian golden age of capitalism that is oftentimes held up by opponents or critics of financialization who see it as parasitic as the supposed paragon of pre-financialized, good, healthy manufacturing capitalism. And in fact, what we show is that financialization emerged right in the heart of the golden age of capitalism precisely because of the contradictions of that period. As Scott said, efforts to suppress finance and to separate it from the industrial corporation led those corporations to internalize financial functions that they now had to carry out for themselves, rather than relying on the banks to do that. And moreover, the very success of capitalism in that period, the very high profits accumulated by those industrial corporations, led them to develop large pools of retained earnings inside of those firms, which were then distributed across the different operations that those firms came to control as they diversified, right? These firms are not just invested in one sector or one operation. They diversify across a range of different business operations. And the allocation of these pools of retained earnings across these different operations is competitive, right? The corporation effectively becomes reorganized as a portfolio of financial assets in which the top managers are money capitalists allocating investment competitively across the different assets that the firm controls, right? Investing where profits are high and divesting from where profits are low. So the process whereby the non-financial corporation financialized was related to the very high profits and the very successes of the Keynesian golden age of capitalism. And this was only intensified and exacerbated as these corporations internationalized and as the operations that they controlled became more complicated. The top management increasingly evolved into money capitalists. The second key argument we try to make is that finance and industry are not separate. So we hear this common framing that finance is the cause of supposed bad capitalism, whereas industry was, or manufacturing-led capitalism is good capitalism. So capitalism dominated by manufacturing firms is good old American healthy golden age capitalism, and the financialized form of capitalism that emerges later is this bad, corrupt, parasitic capitalism. And in fact, as we show in the book, finance and industry have always been interconnected. They are always interconnected in capitalism, but that interconnection has become closer than ever before with the process of globalization, as the internationalization of the financial system has been essential for allowing industrial corporations to circulate capital internationally. And this has become especially close in the new finance capital period, in which the giant asset management companies have become more directly involved and more directly fused with the industrial corporations that they own. So the bottom line here is that there is just no way to separate a group of financial capitalists who have supposedly benefited from globalization on the one hand, from industrial capitalists who have supposedly been victimized by globalization on the other hand, right? The rise of finance did not come at the expense of industrial capital. It enabled the competitiveness and the strength, the rebuilding of the strength of industrial capital coming out of the 1970s crisis. And this is particularly the case, as I was saying, in terms of the new finance capital, this close interconnection. The third argument that we make, and this comes directly out of the second, is that financialization does not signify the decline of capitalism. So obviously, I'm sure everybody in this room is all too aware that we're currently living through a serious range of social crises. We see, all kinds of social maladies associated with inequality, declining life expectancy, even in the case of the United States, for example, something that rarely happens in history outside of periods of warfare and pandemics and so on, even worse than COVID. And obviously, we're living through a serious environmental crisis in which we are facing a serious catastrophe unless we make very significant changes very soon. But that does not mean we're facing a crisis of capitalism. As a matter of fact, capitalism caused these crises and is benefiting from them, right? This is how capitalism functions. The disciplining of labor that led to the inequality that is so pronounced in the current period is not a problem for capital. Capital caused that, and capital is benefiting from it. So very often people conflate these things, right? All the social problems we see and all the environmental crises we see, people assume that must mean that capitalism is breaking down and capitalism isn't working anymore. But that is how it works. And that's always how it works. And anybody who might have forgotten, go back and read, Friedrich Engels' Condition of the English Working Class, and take a look at some social crises that were absolutely essential to the early health and dynamism of capitalism as well. So as Scott said, finance was a solution, not a problem for capital coming out of the 1970s crisis. It restored profits, it facilitated globalization, and it rebuilt the capitalist class power in the United States coming out of the 70s crisis. Today, there's a myth you hear very often that the rise of finance is supposedly causing a decline of investment, that industrial corporations, rather than investing in productive activities, they're simply paying off shareholders and diverting capital to line the pockets of the wealthy. Well, in fact, as we show in the book, this is only true if you look at investment as a percent of profits. But profits are historically high. So yes, as a percentage of profits, investment looks low because profits are so high. But if you look at investment as a percentage of GDP, it is actually right at the post-war norm throughout the whole post-war period and has even been elevated since the 1990s. So investment is normal. Profits and managerial compensation are sky high. In fact, this year, corporate profits are at record highs. Meanwhile, R&D spending is at a record high for industrial corporations in the United States. So if there's a crisis of the capitalist system, capitalists would be very interested to hear that. And it doesn't seem like they're feeling that there's a crisis. Meanwhile, you have intensified labor discipline and exploitation leading to those profits, which is, of course, in no way a problem for capitalism. That's how capitalism works. In other words, there's this kind of argument that financialization means the system is broken and therefore needs to be fixed. What Scott and I are basically saying is that the system is working exactly as it should and therefore needs to be overthrown, right, and gotten rid of. And that's a very, very important difference, obviously. The fourth key argument that we try to make is that financialization is not monopolization. There's a very common argument, in fact, the usual framing of monopoly capitalism or whatever, is that capitalism in the Garden of Eden, distant past, originary moment, was this purely competitive systems such as you read about in neoclassical economics textbooks. And then over time, as concentration and centralization of capital occurred, and you have a smaller number of firms, right, because of concentration and centralization, selling in each market, that competition declines. So you move from a period of perfect competition to a period of increasingly imperfect competition and monopolization. This is what you might call a quantity theory of competition, right? Which holds that basically competition is a function of the number of sellers in a particular market. Well, Scott and I challenge that. We argue that, following Marx in Capital Volume 3, that competitiveness is better seen as a function of capital mobility. It happens as competition occurs as capital flows into those outlets with relatively high returns and flows out of those outlets with relatively low returns. So it follows from that as the movement of capital becomes easier because of things like the development of the financial system, competition actually intensifies. All outlets for investment face the discipline of either maximizing monetary returns or facing the withdrawal of investment. And so the development of the financial system enables the mobility of capital across space and across all the different branches of the economy, and therefore intensifies the competitiveness of capitalism. And the same can be said for the giant corporation, right? The giant corporation is more competitive than smaller firms, and that's precisely why they're so predominant. They have much greater capacity to invest, to move money around to where profits are high, and to withdraw it and restructure away from where profits are low. And they allocate their capital accordingly. So they are far more competitive because far more mobile than smaller firms. So the fifth argument we try to make is that the state never retreated, right? There's this idea that with neoliberalism, you saw the retreat of the state, and so on and such forth. Or that the state has been captured by finance and forced to do the bidding of the financial sector, and therefore hollowing out, participating and enabling the hollowing out of industrial capitalism. What we show in the book is that actually, with the rise of finance, we see the rise of a more authoritarian state that is more closely integrated with the financial system, to the extent that following 2008, especially following the COVID-19 crisis in 2021, the difference between state power and private financial power has effectively been erased. And that where the state ends and the private financial system begins is hard to ascertain, right? The state stands behind and has effectively integrated state power with the core institutions and assets of the private financial system. So capitalists today kind of have the best of both worlds. They have a financial system that is in private hands, that is run based on profit maximization for private institutions, and yet is fully supported by the state, right? Fully supported by the state, and that is above all indicated by too big to fail. And we call that the statization of finance, which has really proceeded significantly since 2008. The final argument we try to make is that finance capital is distinct from neoliberalism. And that this gets exactly what Scott was just saying, so we don't need to belabor the point. But the basic idea here, as I'm sure you have gathered, is that we are in a period of unprecedented concentration and centralization of ownership. In the whole history of capitalism, unprecedented concentration and centralization of ownership in the hands of just 3 financial institutions. But the key point is that we try to make is that this is still capitalism, right? There's a lot of literature out there you see from social democratic writers especially that these big 3 financial institutions have supposedly constructed a planned economy. And as they expand their holdings across a wider range of firms, they basically somehow stop them from competing, and because that's in their interest to maximize profits. What we show is that this whole system remains competitively disciplined, and that the big 3 asset management companies have an interest in maximizing the profitability of each and every individual firm they hold in their portfolios. So it is still capitalism, it's still a competitive, market-based, private profit maximization-driven system. And so when asset managers do intervene, they do so to maximize firm-level competitiveness. So I'm going to just wrap up by flagging what I think are 3 of the political implications, the most important political implications of this analysis, and why I think this book is so important politically. First is that if finance was parasitic on industry, that would lead us to conclude that workers should form an alliance with industrial firms, that is to say, their bosses, in order to rein in the real exploiters and the real parasites who are the financial institutions. So the political implications of saying finance is parasitic is that workers should join forces with industrial capitalists to get rid of the dysfunctional financial power, the dysfunctional power of the financial sector. And that simply doesn't hold because their interests are completely interconnected and today all but inseparable, given globalization and so on. The second key argument we try to take on is this idea that there could be a worker alliance with finance around either the environment or fiscal expansion, right? You see this argument made a lot too, that with the rise of the big three asset management companies, what's often called asset manager capitalism, that these asset management firms, they have an interest in internalizing externalities in their portfolio firms. And so what that basically means is that they have an interest in fixing the environment, or that they're less worried about inflation than traditional financial institutions. And so workers can kind of form an alliance with this liberal financial bloc around new social policies, new fiscal programs, or perhaps fixing the climate crisis. And of course, as we show, that is simply not the case, right? The maximizing the competitiveness of the firms that they own means that they have no such interest in empowering workers or in undertaking costly measures to deal with the climate crisis and the green transition we so urgently need. The third key argument we try to take on is that workers should find an interest in that the main problem with capitalism and the main thing we should be worried about is the need to restore competitiveness. That all these firms are monopolistic and they're charging high prices and they're not competing, so we need Elizabeth Warren to come in and break up the monopolies, and then consumers will benefit from this because prices will be reduced. And again, that's just, first of all, empirically wrong because it is competitive and more competitive than ever before. But secondly, even if it weren't empirically wrong, this is really problematic because intensifying competitiveness isn't good for workers. Workers have no interest in competitiveness. Competitiveness means pressure to cheapen commodities. It means pressure to reduce wages. And it means pressure to externalize environmental costs, right? Three of the major challenges that we face all would be worsened by a program to intensify competitiveness. So workers have no interest in that. So where does this leave us? Well, Scott and I make the case that we need to think about moving towards a system of democratic socialist planning. And we have some ideas in the book in the last chapter about how we might think about doing that. But it starts first and foremost with thinking about how to turn the financial system into a public utility and to run it as a public utility, not as a for-profit concern. And to therefore move toward a situation in which we can allocate investment not based on maximizing profits for investors, but based on social need and environmental need. And that has to be the horizon for socialist politics today. So with that, we can turn it over to some discussion. Look forward to hearing what people have to say.
Thank you. Give it up for Stephen.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. Before I pass the microphone over to the audience, I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you. So the first one is, how does American finance affect the nature of American imperialism?
So I think this is a really, really good question, actually, because it gets right at the heart of how we understand imperialism. I think, part of the declinist argument, part of the idea that finance is parasitic, part of that argument is this idea that the American empire is in decline, right? And that the financialization of the American political economy also is part of the decline of the American empire. And as we show in the book, and especially as Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin show in their much better book, The Making of Global Capitalism, a much more important book, The Making of Global Capitalism, the financialization of the global economy was a structural foundation for American imperial power, not a challenge to it, right? It was a condition that facilitated and enabled the construction of the American empire. So financialization, far from challenging the American empire or indicating the decline of the American empire, was actually the realization of the American empire in its most complete form. A world of frictionless capital accumulation, relatively speaking, in which finance can circulate at, relatively freely across borders, wherever profits and returns are the highest. So this is what the American empire is all about, right? The making of global capitalism. So finance is the American empire in a lot of ways.
The book is primarily about U.S. financial history, but during this period during the period that you described, what was going on in the rest of the world?
No, nothing. Next question, please.
So our focus is in the book, and I think one of the things that's interesting to see, to show, and we really look at this in the last two chapters of the book, is the way in which the restructuring of U.S. finance has an enormous impact on the nature of global financial markets and global capitalism. This is picking up on the same point Steve raised earlier. But given the centrality of the American financial system to global finance and to global capitalism, the extension of the Fed's responsibilities after the 2008 financial crisis, and even before it, of course, really, and this, of course, remains to play out, but had at least the initial effect of drawing other countries ever more deeply into the U.S. dollar system. The Fed's development of protections for what are called repurchase markets, the Fed's development of swap lines of credit made it much easier for countries all across the world to hold U.S. dollar debt, stabilize the U.S. financial system and the dollar-based financial system, and really had an effect of extending, in many respects, U.S. informal empire and the strength of U.S. financial markets inside other social formations. And of course, this had a range of other effects on these social formations, which we don't look at in the book, but which are kind of dealt with elsewhere, I suspect.
I may add one point. Hello? I may add one point to this, which is I'm just going to humbly and hesitantly put forward one of the theses that we do advance in the book, which is that we kind of push Marx's logic one step further based on tying together the threads of Marxian theory without generalizing too much from the American case. That there is a tendency in capitalism, as we all know, toward concentration and centralization of capital, right? A smaller number of larger units of capital, bigger firms, etc. And this process of concentration and centralization is driven forward by the logic of competition, right? It's competition that pushes forward concentration and centralization. Since finance intensifies the competitiveness of capital, since the firms, right, that are most mobile, most able to move capital around in search of maximum returns, are the most profitable. They can restructure the most easily by moving into places where profits are high, sectors where profits are high, and out of where profits are low, maximizing profits. This means that there's a tendency in capitalism toward, which I think the American story that we tell bears out very strongly. There's a tendency in capitalism toward concentration, centralization, and financialization. And I think this thesis would be an interesting starting point for research into other social formations, which, especially in the advanced capitalist world, all underwent financialization in general terms in the same general periods. So it could be interesting to think about that way too.
In the process of writing this book, did any of your preconceptions change? Did you come into the book with a different idea about how the financial system works, or anything like that, or did it just confirm things you already do?
Both of us have written, both of our second book. Each of us wrote a first book separately, and then this is our second book, which we wrote together. And I think that the kind of starting point for this book was the ending point of the books that each of us wrote previously. And so we had these kind of theses in our mind. And I was just kind of reading William Lazonick and, Robert Brenner and Cedric Durand and just getting pissed off about these arguments about the parasitism of finance and the social democratic implications of that, about class compromises and class alliances. Social democratic politics, by the way, which is a dead end, ultimately, right? And so that was kind of the primary motivation. But I mean, in the course of writing this book, we had to do a lot of theoretical development based on the historical information that we uncovered. And there's a lot of stuff in there that Scott and I spent many hours, and I mean many, going back and forth, figuring out over the 2 years it took us to write the book. I mean, the process of writing this book was really interesting. Actually, it's a marvel of technology. We would 5 days a week get on. I was in British Columbia, Scott was in Ontario, and we would wake up at 9, get on FaceTime audio on our headphones, on our laptops, and be on the same Google Doc. And we would write together, looking at the same Google document on FaceTime, talking to each other from 9 a.m. until 4 or 5 p.m., 5 days a week for 2 years. And during that period, there was a lot of this. Some of those days involved a lot of writing. Some of those days we wrote a sentence. And every single word of every single sentence was haggled over and debated, I can assure you, and is the result of a process of compromise and negotiation and a lot of thinking through stuff in that book. And this new thing about techno-feudalism that Yanis Varoufakis and others are putting forward, which I think is totally silly. There's theory in the book that I think really speaks to what they're talking about, which we developed in the course of writing this, especially this notion of asset-based accumulation, which you'll see in the final chapters. So yeah, we definitely came up with a lot of new stuff, I think, for sure, as we were doing it.
I think there's one thing that stands out to me that was perhaps a bit of a surprise in the research process, was really the extent to which the state is involved today in financial markets and has developed its capacity since 2008. I followed this trend, pretty tightly, pretty closely for years, but actually writing about it, you really realize how, even troubling the concept of relative autonomy is in the financial system, given the fact the state the Federal Reserve is intimately involved on a second-by-second basis within the financial system to such a degree that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to understand where one ends and the other begins. And I think the way in which state capacity was developed out of the 2008 crisis and the extension of that relationship, I think, surprised even me to some extent. And it really stands out as a learning moment. Despite the fact that I had written and we had written on the role of the state within neoliberal accumulation, et cetera, for a long period of time, and both studied under Leo and Sam, who of course have written on these issues as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, let's give it up for Scott and Steve once again. And we want to invite the audience to ask questions now.
Okay, so briefly on crypto, I think one of the things the historical analysis that we provide demonstrates is that is the tight linkage between entities that function as money, assets that function as money in states, and particular central banks. This raises immediate issues for crypto, because it's not tied to the liquidity generating capacity of the central bank. It's not tied into the essential pyramid of money creation in the banking system, which is of course all organized to some degree through the Federal Reserve. And so, I think what this points to, one of the things we're pointing to, I guess indirectly, is the way in which the banking system and credit money is fundamentally integrated into the state and is able to function as money precisely due to that integration. And what you see through the historical analysis that we provide is the state tightening ever more the linkage between private credit money and state money. Again, can I get in this point that money is neither private nor public? It's a kind of a hybridity between the two. And you see this once again in the 2008 financial crisis with the development of state capacities to manage new forms of repo money and repo credit. And that very much parallels what happened in the 1930s when the state stepped into the FDIC and the Federal Reserve to manage the banking system and to effectively remove some of the risks associated with, the private banking system, allowing bank money to function as money. Crypto suffers because it's disconnected from the state in a real substantive way.
Bank money just meaning the credit created by banks.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
When banks make loans, that's bank money.
Yeah. So for us, the risk state is defined a bit more narrowly, perhaps, than it's defined by others who had, developed this understanding of the risk state, I guess, in parallel. For us, it's the real essential feature of the risk state is the application of state power to absorb and deflect financial risk. So when the state, for example, initiates quantitative easing and buys trillions of dollars of not just mortgage-backed securities and treasury debt, but also corporate debt, what it's doing is reducing the risk of holding that debt. If the state is an active agent in purchasing corporate bonds, mortgage-backed securities, even forms of derivatives, etc., then there's very little risk in holding those assets because you have a continuous supply of demand coming from the central government whose balance sheet is endless. I mean, theoretically, the Fed can absorb the entire US economy onto its balance sheet, right? Now, that would, of course, pose a whole range of problems, but the essential point is that its credit-generating capacities are completely and utterly limitless, bounded only by the extent to which foreign agents in particular are willing to accept the long-term credibility of U.S. debt. So, what characterizes the post-2008 period in this sense is the state's increasing willingness and eagerness to buy up financial assets, to de-risk those financial assets. And that has a tremendously significant impact on the entire financial system and the global financial system. One of them, of course, is just asset price appreciation. This is one of the major contradictions, and the big asset management firms benefit tremendously from this. If the Fed is buying up all the treasury securities, and if the Fed is buying up all mortgage-backed securities, and these assets are becoming more and more kind of absorbed onto the Fed's balance sheet, the financial intermediaries that previously held those assets are going to look for other assets, right, that are also very secure, or the next best asset, and they buy up other assets like corporate bonds from other agencies and other intermediaries, which then have to go searching for other assets to hold on their balance sheet because they're all profit maximizing. And the effect of this is equity price inflation, right? A long-term kind of boom in equity markets as a result of the Fed's de-risking of quantitative easing. So the effect, what I'm trying to say is the effects of this process of de-risking that the Fed initiated, right, were astronomical in terms of the overall shape of the U.S. economy. Now, it's always been the case, of course, right, that the state, right, the liberal democratic state has intimately, involved itself in all manner of, capitalist exercises, right? But what distinguishes the present moment, right, is the way in which now, to a greater extent, it's involved in de-risking all of these kind of financial assets, and the effects of this, as I mentioned, are quite significant. So when we talk about the risk state, we're talking foremost about these characteristics of the risk state, and of course this means the financial branch of the state, led by the Federal Reserve, right, has gained increasing prominence. Now, one of the interesting points, and I'll end here, because there's other questions to get to, is that as the Federal Reserve, the central bank, and this happens not just in the US, but elsewhere, absorbs the lion's share or a good portion of government debt, right, to stabilize the financial system, it allows governments to then issue more debt, right? Because their debt's just being automatically absorbed by the central bank as being quote unquote monetized. right? But this is not the return of the dominance of fiscal policy over monetary policy. It does not mean at all that fiscal policy is now on the same footing as monetary policy, because the central bank, the de-risking, which is the center of the de-risking state, always holds the hammer. It holds the trump card. It can decide how much and when it will stop purchasing federal debt, right? And as a result, right, the accumulation of deficits could face an endpoint, could face a barrier, could face market discipline, right?
So yeah, so I guess the point about the Fed and monetization, it just means that the state is basically lending to itself, right? The Federal Reserve is buying up the bonds issued by the Treasury Department. And so when Congress makes fiscal policy, if it runs a deficit, the Treasury Department, and of course fiscal policy, congressional spending, means elected representatives making decisions over what's spent, right? And if it's in a deficit, then the Treasury Department issues a bond, and if the Federal Reserve is buying up all that debt, then we're good. If the Federal Reserve decides it's not going to do that, then you have to face the discipline of how much interest rates are going to be when Congress is spending all this money. So the power remains in the hands of the Fed, in the sense that the Fed's the one that gets to decide if it's going to buy the debt or not. And if it doesn't, if the Fed decides, you're saving the financial system, that's fine, okay, unlimited spending, no problem. You want to expand universal child care. Looks like we can't buy the debt anymore, Bernie Sanders, President of the United States, you know what I mean? So it's always, there's very firm checks. The structure of state power is very much embedded in the interests of the capitalist class, and those interests are just as firmly protected as ever before by the fact that the Federal Reserve, extremely undemocratic institution, right, regulatory independence, is what the Fed is all about, is still firmly the center of state power. So that's what the stakes are when we're talking about fiscal versus monetary policy. Does Congress have control over government macroeconomic policy, or is it in the hands of effectively an unelected and totally insular part of the state bureaucracy that has zero democratic accountability, right? In terms of Simon's question about monopoly, it's a hard question, but the way I would, to answer quickly, and I don't want to take too much time, but the way I would put this is that in the context of the competitive struggle between different assets, between firms that are investing in different outlets for that investment, right? Capitalists that are investing in different outlets for that investment. Monopoly arises when one of those institutions has the possession of an asset that none of its competitors can possess. So Marx in Capital Volume 3 uses the example of a waterfall. A privately owned and controlled waterfall on a piece of land that one particular capitalist has access to as a source of power that none of the competing firms also can use. And that means that those other competing firms have to use more expensive methods and more capital-intensive methods of generating power, such as steam. And that requires investment, right? And therefore lower margins. So monopoly in this sense does not amount to, we control the market, so therefore we can charge monopoly prices. It's in the context of a competitive struggle between all assets, between all outlets for investment. If there's one particular investment that allows for extra efficiency, extra reduction of costs relative to all the competitors, that is a kind of monopoly asset. And we can think of this in many different ways. One way we can think of it is like a brand. Like this shirt that I'm wearing now is made by LL Bean. And there's only one brand named LL Bean. Nobody else can make a shirt called that. So if that's a particularly important brand, there's a certain monopolistic element of that, right? Like, especially in the context of certain companies that have particularly valuable brands, they're the only ones that can use that brand. And that has actually been critical for financialization too, in ways we can discuss. But as these firms have all now subcontracted the production of the actual products that they're making, they license these subcontract firms to be able to use the brands, stamp it on the product, which is then sold in stores. We all know this with Apple and Foxconn, right? Foxconn is obviously not part of Apple, but they get licensed to make Apple products with Apple branding on it, which then Apple sells in the US for a lot of profits. So this is monopolization should be thought of that way, right? Not as the opposite of competitiveness, but as dialectically, if you like, interconnected with the competitive dynamics of a capitalist economy, if that makes sense. It was a pretty quick explanation, but.
Just to add to that, maybe if I can really briefly, what this means is that centralization and concentration does not equate to monopolization, right?
this question on the state and the transformation of finance into a public utility. Scott and I have argued that one of the ways that we could think about doing this is by setting up what Sauli Omarova has called a national investment authority, which is basically an institution that would be supported by, and we can get into the mechanics of this, but without going too into the weeds, supported by the full faith and credit of the American state, and would be able to generate credit and allocate it to firms without necessarily doing that on the basis of market competitiveness. So because the Federal Reserve has this power that Scott just mentioned to be able to issue credit in an unlimited fashion, effectively, the drawing on that power, democratizing that power, and using it as the foundation to direct investment towards socially useful and socially necessary and environmentally necessary purposes based on a social plan is one way we can think about democratizing control of credit. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this is still, insofar as it still exists within capitalism, this will be disciplined by capital and will be serving the interests of the capitalist class unless barring the outcome of social struggles, right? So just creating an NIA within a capitalist state isn't enough, right? One has to keep in mind that there's a need to build a working class struggle to make that responsive to democratic needs and interests and so on as part of a broader process of transforming the state and ultimately taking capital away from capital, right? And leading to a qualitative social shift. And maybe Scott will say a little bit more about that too. In terms of Greg's question, I think one thing that comes to mind when I was listening to Greg's question is this recent IMF paper by Barry Eichengreen, which basically showed that foreign exchange holdings of U.S. dollars by states around the world has declined somewhat and has been replaced by, or has at the expense of, or to the advantage of, a basket of currencies other than the U.S. dollar. And the immediate assumption I think people will come to when I say this is that, oh, it's the renminbi. It's China, that's the rise of China in this context. But in fact, what the analysis that Eichengreen did for the IMF shows is that the currencies that gained at the expense of the slight decline of the dollar were currencies that were all supported by the Federal Reserve after the 2008 crisis with unlimited swap lines of credit. And so what that basically means is that the Federal Reserve stands behind the value of those currencies after the 2008 crisis by supplying them, those central banks, with unlimited dollars, and therefore guaranteeing the exchangeability of those currencies with the dollar. In other words, this is an extension of the dollar system, not a decline of the dollar system. Now, there is of course the question of Russia and the Russian sanctions and various efforts to construct alternative monetary and trade zones that are more independent and autonomous from the U.S. state. And there's no telling. Obviously, we see the U.S. has lost its ability to just in a unilateral way get whatever it wants around the world, as is apparent in the day-to-day news that we read every morning. But at the same time, the U.S. remains overwhelmingly the most powerful state in the world and in a unique way serves this imperial function of supporting international monetary and trade relations still. So there's no telling where that goes in the future and what that erosion will look like going forward, but I think a lot of decentralization is a kind of dialectical relationship between the decentralization of these monetary relations and their continuing support for them by the U.S. Federal Reserve in the case of foreign exchange at the very least. So the dollar's role as world money seems to me to be quite strong at the moment, whatever may happen over the next decades.
I agree with what Steve just said. I mean, I gave a presentation when the sanctions on Russia were issued at my home institution, and I anticipated at the time that those sanctions would have a much deeper impact than they've had. So to answer that question, yes, I was surprised, definitely. And I think it certainly demonstrates the way in which China and Russia are able to evade the global U.S. payment system. Now, to some extent, the market-based financial system allows for that, right? Because it allows for its deep, long chain of intermediation. It allows for complex trading around the kind of the structure set up by the U.S. and Europe and the payment system that has been able to kind of regulate the movement, or does regulate the movement of capital globally. But I think what this demonstrates, to Steve's point perhaps, if I had to speculate, is that while we might be seeing, right, alternative movements and that demonstrate some degree of multipolarity, they're ultimately, overall, this is occurring within a US-based financial system where still 70% to 90% of trade is financed and foreign currency is financed and derivatives are financed on the US dollar. And I think one can't lose sight of that. And in many respects, that system has been strengthened, not eroded after 2008, and reinforced, quite frankly, after 2021.
Yeah, let me just add one quick point to that. And this is kind of what the relative autonomy of the state also means, right? Saying state power is fused and integrated with the financial system in new ways and underpins financial stability and the reproduction of a stable monetary system doesn't mean that the state is like in command of how that system is organized geospatially, right? And I think, Greg, as you wrote in your 2004 Register essay, that I think remains foundational in terms of an understanding of world order. The American empire has always been kind of characterized by a somewhat contested and contradictory interaction between three different economic zones, not even including what's going on in the global periphery with economic development, East Asia, Europe, and North America, And so there's always been a kind of uneven interaction between those three zones that's always been kind of a component of the American empire as well.
The state in the new finance capital period, basically we think the authoritarian nature of the state that evolved, of the liberal democratic state in the US that evolved through the neoliberal period remains firmly in check and has been strengthened in many respects because of the further concentration of power within the Federal Reserve. So the authoritarian state that emerged, that characterized the neoliberal period, for us very much characterizes the new finance capital period. One illustration of this is the Fed's complete control, or the extension of the Fed's power to repo markets. Repo markets were previously relatively unregulated. And the major kind of regulatory shift after 2008 didn't come from Congress, but came from the Federal Reserve absorbing tri-party repo markets, short-term funding markets that are the center of this kind of long chain of market-based finance and shadow banking, basically onto its balance sheet, guaranteeing a floor and a ceiling for rates in the same way it does in the traditional banking system. So I think what that demonstrates is that the Fed remains the center of state power, and the Fed, of course, is completely insulated from democratic pressure and protected from democratic pressure by the very power of finance, right? So I think that very much remains. The implications of high levels of U.S. debt, I don't see this as terribly significant, to be honest. I think the Fed has shown the willingness to monetize this if it's destabilizing. But again, this kind of gets us back to if credit provision now, if credit is provided no longer by banks, but by shadow banks, and this entire credit system hinges on ownership of assets, particularly government assets. There's an incessant and constant need to accumulate government assets. So I think as the system becomes more kind of decentralized and market-based in that sense, as shadow banks become ever more prominent actors within credit provision, within global capitalism, we have to begin to readjust what is like an acceptable number, for the debt, right? As long as private financial actors are absorbing U.S. Treasury debt, $30 trillion is not a big deal. There's also, of course, lingering in the background, the MMT point, right? That it's its own debt, right? This gets to the monetization point, I think, that we were raising earlier, although we don't talk about this in terms of MMT for reasons we can get into later. But it's interest that it owes on $30 trillion of debt on money that it itself prints, right? At the very least, the Federal Reserve can absorb that, and on top of that, the private financial system has an increased willingness now to hold Treasury debt because it's the major source of credit globally. So I'm not as concerned with that, although of course it's contradictory and it could be destabilizing, most certainly.
One last point about the risk state, Paul's question. It's just a quick point. It's easy to hear Scott say something like, "Oh, repo markets used to be unregulated, and now they're really regulated," and just hear that as like, "Oh yeah, it's just like a continuation of the same thing. They're just kind of in a linear way accumulating more functions." And what it really means, as we talk about in the book and break down in much more detail, is actually a very significant shift in the center of gravity of the entire monetary system. Like how the monetary system is organized and how the central bank engages in supporting the monetary system and the credit system. It's a complete restructuring, a very significant restructuring of how credit is generated, how the state supports the generation of credit, and how the monetary system is linked to the Federal Reserve. It's a very significant shift. And the radical protections that the Federal Reserve developed after 2021 with the COVID crisis is a transformation of the way the central bank functions on the order of what was done after 1929, when the Fed developed for the first time tools to safeguard and regulate the banking system. What's happening now is the Federal Reserve is developing a whole new range of tools and powers to safeguard, stabilize what you might call the shadow banking system, which basically just means institutions doing bank stuff that aren't banks, right? And the Federal Reserve has developed a new range of powers to protect and stabilize that sector of the economy. And so that's what Scott's really describing there.
It's just to kind of, make one further point there. One of the things we really wanted to do with this book is provide a relatively accessible introduction to how this all works. And it's difficult to stand up here and talk about what repo markets are clearly in 20 seconds. But the book really attempts to do this. And what we're trying to argue with New Finance Capital is that first we have to understand that the nature of the financial system has changed radically over the last 40 years. We've gone from a bank-based system to a market-based system, governed primarily by these non-bank banks or shadow banks. And what we have to do is understand the institutions at the center of that market-based financial system, and those institutions are also, in a sense, the asset management firms. And so when we trace the rising power of asset management firms, a good part of it, of course, is their control over equity. But another part of it is their integration and the critical role they play within a market-based financial system. And then, of course, it's not surprising the state after 2008 absorbs that market-based financial system into its own balance sheet in radical new ways. Very reminiscent of what it did after 1933, right, with the regular banking system. And in a sense now the shadow banking system and shadow banks, including like hedge funds to some degree, are just like subsidiaries of the state in a sense, to riff on Salio Moroba's kind of description of this as well.
The comment that Simon made about fictitious capital is, I have something to say here that I feel like I'm coming out a little bit. Marx was not always 100% right about everything, and I think I think part of the part of understanding Marx, especially in volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, which are incredibly important texts to read, is that a lot of the theses he's putting forward in those texts are kind of things he's developing and thinking about. And if you look at the concept of fictitious capital, it's really, if you just go to the chapter in volume 3 called Fictitious Capital, it's literally just notes. It doesn't even actually have any argumentation or theory in it at all. It was just notes that Engels had cobbled together. He does use the concept elsewhere in the text, but it's part of an, unfortunately, which we try to finish in our book, it's unfortunately part of an underdeveloped theorization that Marx was working on about interest-bearing capital. And his Marx's theory of the credit system in volume 3 in chapters 30 through 33 especially is very rudimentary. These chapters are sketches, they're very unfinished, and he's kind of beginning to develop a theory of credit that actually anticipates in a very surprising sometimes way some of the supposedly cutting edge theory of post-Keynesian economists today. And in fact, very little of that theory has significantly gone places that Marx wasn't already considering going, at least in volume 3, and kind of already working towards. So that's actually kind of surprising. But the notion of fictitious capital in volume 3 is really just a name Marx gives to certain kinds of interest-bearing capital. And there's certain circuits of capital that he shows are deeply interconnected with the quote-unquote real economy, right? Marx is not at any time in Capital arguing that there's a separation between fictitious capital and real capital, or that fictitious capital, as he calls it, is not fundamentally coming to bear on the real economy and deeply functionally important for how the real economy works, which is why the term is so open to abuse and misuse and vulgarization, which is exactly what's going on. Most time when people talk about fictitious capital, they have just vulgarized Marx's theory, not really paid attention to all the bits that they don't want to think about, and then repeated the same banalities about financial parasitism and all the rest of it. And I think that's why we don't use the term, not to say that the stuff Marx is talking about in those parts of the text aren't important, and they are, and the theory is actually, a good one. But the term itself is open to abuse, both because of the unfinished nature of that text and because of the word fictitious capital, right? Which he's trying to use to understand a certain aspect of the financial system, but he's very careful to say at all points and to show how deeply interconnected this fictitious capital, these forms of interest-bearing capital, are with the real economy. So just that term it's misleading at best. So we don't use it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the reality is if Canada attempted to democratize investment right now, it would, that would entail, confronting the power of domestic banks. That would entail all manner of dispute with global financial markets, etc., for sure. And this does come down to class struggle, right? Now, we just wrote a piece on capital controls, which has some bearing on this, and certainly any type of attempt to democratize investment will require the implementation of capital controls. You can read that in Jacobin if you like, and that might go some way to addressing how this might get done, but it's all underpinned by struggle. Agreed.
All right, so with that, I want to thank Scott. And please sign up to our email newsletter and keep an eye out on leopanitchschool.ca for news from the school and events like this.